It's my pleasure now to introduce Ann Neuberger. Ann is the NSA's Director of Cybersecurity. She has served at NSA for 11 years and has had several jobs there, including as Deputy Director of NSA's operations, where she led cybersecurity operations, and she was also the agency's first Chief Risk Officer. One thing that I think sets Ann apart is that she has an MBA. I mean, she can speak to business, she can speak to government and speak policy at the same time. And I think now in this new role as Director of Cybersecurity, her desire to do outreach more to companies really puts her in a unique, with that background, puts her in a unique ability to go out and have real conversations with people and move cybersecurity issues forward. In my time, I'll say that I worked with Ann for the 6 years that I was in government, and you're not going to find a more dedicated public servant to the mission that she has. And I was always really impressed with that, and I feel lucky to have her serving in this role as a taxpayer. And I appreciate her time coming today. So I'm going to hand it off to Ann, and can't wait to hear what she has to say.
Ari, thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to see you. It's great to see so many others. Really appreciated. That's a particularly high mark, return on investment for your taxpayer money. Okay, that will inspire me every morning. So thank you for that. So in talking with Ari and with Grant about this talk, they asked me to talk a bit about the work of the cybersecurity mission, our top threats that we see, what our focus areas are, and then I had some questions for you at the end. I know you'll have some questions for me as well. So first, the decision to stand up the Cybersecurity Directorate, NSA had long had two missions, a foreign intelligence and a cybersecurity mission, but the decision to really invest in our cybersecurity mission stemmed from a sense that our nation was at a significant crossroads with our national security, as there were enormous technological and societal shifts that were converging, and the world that we inhabited was evolving quickly. China has now become a peer, a powerful economy, a growing military, and really a leader in technology, and increasingly willing to intimidate with a more aggressive risk calculus. So we work to, in our cybersecurity mission, integrate intelligence, our focus on understanding nation-state actors, their capabilities, their infrastructure, how they seek to integrate cyber within their national objectives, with practical advice on how to counter their tactic, techniques, and procedures. So essentially, we seek to know what our adversaries are doing and to provide that integrated, unclassified advice on how to counter their specific efforts. Our overall mission is to prevent and eradicate threats to the nation's most sensitive networks, with a focus really on the defense industrial base and to work through that. So we recognize that our threat intelligence, though, can be used by network defenders broadly. So we seek to share that advice at an unclassified level to the fullest extent possible, so in a way that's actionable and in a way the public can trust. So I want to talk a bit about the current threats that we're seeing, what we're working to do to address them, and where we see some gaps. So first, near-peer adversaries. China and Russia are well known for using cyber operations as a significant asymmetric force multiplier, and they've historically been emboldened to do so with really minimal consequences. So the speed at which they can convert vulnerabilities to exploit, take a publicly known vulnerability that's just come out and actually use it to weaponize it and gain access to a network they target, can be as little as 48 hours. So with many organizations that we see having testing processes to test a patch of multiple days, that window from when China or Russia can weaponize a new vulnerability before a company or an organization can patch is very significant. China is notable for the scope and scale of their operations. They've used a staggering degree of intellectual property theft to build their economy and military and really build their global ambitions. Russia, in contrast, has waged a disinformation war, often using US technologies and US infrastructure to sow and amplify divisions in our society, in Western societies, with the ultimate goal of eroding trust in democratic institutions. Of note, Russia and China both use technologies that are meant to connect us, to exert more authoritarian control over their own populations, and in many cases work to extend that influence to ours. Moving on, Iran is also a volatile threat. You've seen this recently in the news. Iran has joined Russia in seeking to interfere in our elections. They've also demonstrated their ability and willingness to launch disruptive cyber attacks within their own region, including by public reports, control systems, which is troubling in terms of crossing lines on potential harm to civilians. Ransomware is also a significant threat that we're tracking. With the rise of anonymous currencies, we've seen criminal actors really shifting from stealing credentials for their traditional rob a bank approach to the more lucrative ransomware activity. It became a key priority for us as our government partners at CISA and the FBI flagged it during COVID for expansive targeting of institutions, of hospitals. Government, industry, and our allies alike have all reached the same conclusion that ransomware was a key concern and couldn't be tolerated. I'll talk a little bit more about that with regard to some of the related activities a bit later. So we recognize that as those threats had evolved, as they were becoming greater in scope and scale and rapidity, we needed to evolve and change as well. So we've made some significant operational and cultural changes to drive impact that we hope scales across the cybersecurity community. First, going beyond information sharing. Second, rapid threat tipping, particularly with a focus on the defense industrial base. We're a combat support agency. Third, going all in on our partnerships. And fourth, kicking off a major encryption effort across DoD and the nation's most sensitive networks. So first, going beyond information sharing. We work to shift. Mission success for us is not victim notification, is not notifying a particular organization you've been compromised. Because once they're a victim, the damage is done. We're not going to be recovering those advanced fighter jet engineering plans or a company's millions of dollars of R&D. Once they've become a victim, once the theft has already occurred. So we've shifted our measure of success to preventing and eradicating the threat before the attack or exploitation successfully occurs. You've seen this embodied in the cybersecurity guidance we've shared publicly in our first year, 26 unclassified products available on our website or on our Twitter account. And we focused on sharing unique, actionable, and timely information because information is only as good as the action it compels. So we had two goals for these public releases. First, enabling network defenders to secure their systems against current threats. An example of those products were the product we released on a significant cryptographic vulnerability in Windows 10, or the one we did recently where we noted the 25 CVEs that Chinese nation-state actors are currently actively exploiting. Because we heard loud and clear from the network defender community that there's more alerts, there's more vulnerabilities than they have time to address. So we said, look, the vulnerabilities that nation-state entities are currently exploiting should be at the top of the list. And by working to bring that information together, the intelligence information, the CVE information, to say, here's how network defenders should prioritize their activities, we work to really enable them to achieve the greatest impact. The second goal of our advisories is raising cost on adversaries by publicly exposing their capabilities, tactics, and procedures. And I'll note a couple of advisories in that. One you may have seen about Exim, a mail agent that we saw the Russian intelligence service, the GRU, actively exploiting. And as then we raised awareness about that and then also provided advice on how to secure, how to patch against that. And then the DroverRub advisory that highlighted a specially built Linux malware capability with advice again on how to find it and counter it. That one we made a priority because typically we see nation-state actors using tools that they need to achieve an objective. So if a routine CVE will work and be good enough, they'll use that. But when we see them building specially purpose-built malware that takes a lot of time and attention, that's typically for a higher value target. So we had a lot of concerns that it might be used for the election, and as part of that work to expose that malware to enable the cybersecurity community to build defenses against it. So those are really the examples of those 26 advisories that we felt are at the crux of that culture change of getting out unique, timely, and actionable information that integrates intelligence information with practical advice on how to counter it. Second, the DIV. Our adversaries have consistently infiltrated the defense industrial base for years to steal valuable intellectual property and other sensitive defense information. So in response, we've worked with the CIO of the Department of Defense to enhance direct information sharing with DIB companies and their service providers to get left of that theft. Feedback from the community has been overwhelmingly positive to date, and we continue to expand upon those initial efforts as a combat support agency. Protecting that defense information really resonated deeply. Third, really investing in partnerships and thinking about how we contribute to our partners' success. And I'll highlight two recent efforts that were at the crux of that. Our work on elections, building on the last discussion, which I really enjoyed listening to the tail end of it, and our work on ransomware. Regarding elections, I tip my hat to our close partners at CISA and the FBI for their hard work. We worked incredibly hard to support their efforts to secure the recent elections. Our focus was on tracking foreign threats and rapidly clearing information to be shared with states, local governments, and the private sector. We did some of the best partnership work I've observed us do. For example, we share with our government partners 3,000 indicators of compromise, 200 notifications of victims, 225 more detailed information on specific inquiries related to intelligence reports, and more than 20 leads and tips to our partners at CISA and the FBI to enable security of democratic processes. And of course, they provided tips back that we used to then pursue and identify other activity. With some of the really best partnership efforts where each of us brought our unique game to protecting the most valuable asset we have as a democracy, our democratic processes. A second example of that focus on partnerships was our work on ransomware. We've taken a more proactive approach to partnering with government agencies and other partners to identify ways to make ransomware operations more difficult for our adversaries, less scalable, and less lucrative. So while responsibility for counter-ransomware operations may not always be claimed by those involved, we expect the tempo and intensity of these operations to occur because we want to raise the cost of those operations against the US. Our final effort that I noted as a current priority is modernizing cryptography for the nation's most sensitive networks to counter a world where the telecommunications environment is increasingly untrusted. So those are our really high priority efforts at this moment in time. So let's talk a moment about gaps. First, while certainly a great deal of progress has been made, we recognize that gaps remain, and there are some significant challenges for all of us as a community to overcome. So as I had a chance to look at the background of the participants here, I thought I'd start with one that we hear frequently from organizations, the challenge of enterprise risk management for cybersecurity. We've heard organizations say again and again, millions of dollars are invested in cybersecurity, yet many organizations struggle to communicate the effectiveness of their cybersecurity technology, how it impacts adversarial activity, and where their next investment should occur. They struggle with the question of how do you set a risk appetite? How do you measure investment in new capabilities against that? So during my time as the agency's chief risk officer, we looked at those kinds of hard questions by asking really three kinds of questions. First, what were our high value assets? Did we understand what they were, whether they're on our networks, whether they're on contractor networks to us? And how do we make sure that we can protect those? Second, our reputation is one of our highest value assets. How do we ensure we understand risks to that and ensure that we protect them? And then how do we understand and measure risk holistically across the individual silos of infrastructure, technology, operations, partnerships, so that individuals who may have worked in one area and have significant depth in that area have the opportunity to sit around a table and discuss risks, enterprise risks, learn from others, and learn how their work impacts another area, which is frequently where we may have not fully understood holistic risk in the past. So to get at this problem, we built a model called DODCAR, the DoD Cybersecurity Analysis and Review, which is an analytical model that measures return on investment on cybersecurity investments across the areas of protect, detect, and respond. Essentially, it looks across the steps of the kill chain and aligns different types of cybersecurity capabilities against that in a given architecture, customized for that architecture, to allow an organization to say, where might we have gaps across that, across visibility, across opportunity to respond, and where might we have duplicates that we can harvest investment from? I'm happy to talk more about that. Second, as a gap, the combined effects of disinformation and cyber, hack and leak activities at inopportune times, or a mixture of potentially real and false data accelerated by the reach of social media. We all recall the quote, "A lie can travel around the world faster than truth can get its pants on." For countries or organizations, a hacked Twitter account, as we've seen recently, is a key issue. And artificial intelligence can make false images or data added to this mix an even greater concern. And finally, two more finallys actually. First, speed and agility in cyber matters. And getting a rapid picture across foreign threats to critical infrastructure and critical domestic systems is often challenging. We've made great stride in this area in partnering across the US government, leveraging each of our unique authorities and capabilities to serve as force multipliers for each other. And you've likely seen some of the joint products we've done with CISA and the FBI to get at exactly those kind of topics. And these are deeply, deeply valued partnerships for us. This is especially true for the cybersecurity of national security systems, the sensitive systems which carry national security information, classified information. So we're putting a lot of work into improving threat and mitigation among operators of those critical systems. And finally, trust. Public-private partnership is critical, and we can't expect the public or private industry to trust a black box. So we're working to build trust with the cybersecurity community, showing more of our hand by, for example, accepting attribution when we share a vulnerability so that companies and organizations can see the work that we're doing in that space. And we've done a couple of those in the last couple of weeks. Forums like this one are also an extremely valuable way in building public-private partnerships and building trust amongst all of that. So with that, I'd like to leave some time for questions, and I also have some questions for you, but following those that you may have for me. Thanks again for your time today, and thanks so much, Ari, for the invitation.
Sure, thanks, Ann. Thanks for doing this. Thanks again. So people can ask questions in the Q&A. I know I'll tee up one to get things started here, which is on the relationship with DHS. You talked a little bit about it, and you also talked about the your new move to have attribution when you put out a vulnerability. Can you talk a little bit about where CISA's role ends in terms of vulnerability disclosure and the work that they do in sharing that kind of information, and where you think NSA's begins, and how you coordinate that with those vulnerability sharing with them?
Absolutely, sure. So first, typically the process has worked where we identify a vulnerability in our operations, as you well know, Ari, that goes through the vet process at the White House. And then we typically work, whichever entity identified the vulnerability works to share it quietly with the company so that the company can work to see, do they have an exploit to currently exploit that? And those are usually the priority vulnerabilities to address, and to accelerate delivery of a patch in order to do that. So we typically will provide technical experts. I think of, again, like the Windows 10 cryptographic vulnerability. We had our cryptographic experts working closely to identify how that vulnerability would present, look to see in foreign intelligence if we saw an adversary exploiting that, to help assist the company in determining how rapidly do they need to accelerate a patch to that. We worked closely in that case, for example, with CISA, to set up advanced discussions to tip government CISOs to make sure they were aware of it, and to ensure CISA was positioned to then have discussions across critical infrastructure with companies they brought together to tell them, this is a vulnerability that matters, this is significant, we encourage you to patch. So that's how the partnership typically works in that particular area.
Thanks. Well, here's a question from Steve Crocker, who asked what the NSA is doing with respect to identifying and countering threats to the internet's basic infrastructure, particularly with routing and DNS.
Really good question. So we're focused on foreign threats to that, identifying foreign capabilities and attempts to route that. Clearly, this is an area where we've seen public information around concerns regarding BGP, and around there's great awareness around some of the current vulnerabilities in the way the internet infrastructure is. It was stood up for massive communications and for reducing latency, not necessarily for security. So we quietly work with providers to encourage the more secure protocols, to work in standards bodies to encourage more secure protocols, and where we have threat information about nation-state actors to ensure we can share that information so entities who are making decisions about implementing security practices can say, okay, this is a more near-term issue. As a practical threat, let's accelerate implementation of those security practices.
I know that many of the members of the Cybersecurity Coalition are also members of the Enduring Security Framework, and there's some question about the future of that organization and what it should be. And I don't know how much we want to go into detail about the history of it, et cetera, but just I was wondering if you could address that issue for the people that are sort of in both worlds. So.
Absolutely. And we've clearly been discussing this with CISA quite a bit. I'll share my perspective, which is informed by seeing ESF do really terrific work, seeing it in the past. My perspective is what makes ESF really unique and where it's done the most impactful work is where there's specific threat information, where the ability to truly address it requires a group of companies across the stack, chip companies, operating system companies, software companies, working together to ensure that the threat is truly addressed. And where government can serve as a facilitator and as receiving information, anonymizing it, and then spreading it in a small group. So for example, I highlight, of course, many of us recall the work ESF did in BIOS just about a little bit less than 10 years ago. And what made that partnership work was there was a practical focused threat. It required partnership across the types of companies I noted, and companies were not comfortable sharing with their competitors details about what percentage of their product lines were at risk or were vulnerable. So the government was able to serve a useful forum, not only in bringing technical experts to bear, in a really kind of narrow space across NIST, NSA, DHS at the time, but also to say, okay, we'll gather that you'll share with us the information about what percentage of your product lines are vulnerable. And we'll say overall, across the industry, 80% are vulnerable. And then we can work with each entity to help essentially help them put that in place. And then most importantly, in some cases, use the power of government procurement to say, we will purchase as a DoD, as the broader US government, we will purchase products that meet the standards as documented in a particular government standard. In this case, it was a NIST special publication. So we accelerate the market by priming the pump to say, we value this security. So I think those three attributes coming together, a particular threat and area of focus that requires a set of partnership across companies and where we can also, as government, bring some unique value. Operational efforts is where we see ESF brings value. And I know in talking with both my counterpart, Chris Krebs at CISA, we're both committed to drive ESF to those kind of operational efforts. You see that now, there's one current effort. We necked it down, one current operational effort, participants only who bring game to that particular 5G effort, because 5G is a perfect example of that kind of a threat and the kind of promise of what public-private partnership can do in this space.
Well, we do have more questions, but the time is we're at the end of the time. Can you take a couple more, or do you need to get going to the next meeting?
I really appreciate the questions. I will take, if there are, I'll take a couple more, and then I'd like folks to think about my question, which then maybe, Ari, if there's a way to get that back to me, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay, sure. Well, here's one from, which is on routing and DNS. Does that mean we can expect procurement criteria around ISPs? Is that what you mean by when you're talking about routing and your answer on routing and DNS? That's not necessarily the way I took it, but I don't know.
That's not necessarily, but I do think that's not necessarily the way what I had in mind. But I do think the point is well taken, that we can and we should be using the power of government procurement to certainly accelerate adoption of security standards, and that's certainly something we're tracking, particularly in the Department of Defense and the IC. Mm-hmm.
And then David Hoffman asks about your relationship with the Civil Liberties and Privacy Office and how that oversight works and how you're collaborating with them.
Got it. Hi, David. Good to hear from you. So the Civil Liberties and Privacy Office in NSA is one of our strongest important partners. NSA has made a big push on increasing transparency following, in the last number of years. And certainly having a voice who came from the privacy community, who's in the decisions, who's fully cleared and is a part of the decisions, as part of those risk framework decisions I mentioned earlier, ensures that privacy and civil liberties has a seat at the table in all of our operations. So really strong partnership there.
Great.
So do I get to ask a question?
Yes, now we'd like to ask your questions, and we'll end there. Yeah, that's great.
Right. And really my question is feedback from the community on the products we've issued in our first year. Are they helpful? Feedback on what is most useful in terms of, again, working to share threat information in a timely, unique, and actionable way. We would really welcome that feedback as we look to frame our next year's work, our next year's partnerships.
Well, I know the Cybersecurity Coalition and probably Cyber Threat Alliance too would be happy to meet with you on that point, actually separately. So I will ask for request a meeting down the road once, perhaps at the beginning of the new year, on that. We can look back on the year of 2020 on that. But for those that are not members, I put it in the chat, and we will forward it on to Anne, the answers in the chat on that question, because it's a great question. I think we want to help you do better, and I do think that I've only heard good things about the way things have been going, but obviously you can always make them better. So it's good to get that feedback. We really thank you for your time and your willingness to do this. Obviously, NSA is not known for its outreach until now, so we appreciate that this kind of new NSA and the role you're playing and make it happen. So we hope we can continue working with you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Take care and be well, everyone.
Yeah.